5 days after the fall of Fort Sumter to Confederate troops, a massive crowd gathered at the President Street train station in Baltimore as a train carrying about 700 men from Massachusetts pulled up. These men were part of 75,000 volunteers called to action by President Lincoln in response to the surrender at Fort Sumter. The troops were headed to Washington, D.C., but Baltimore's laws prohibited trains from traveling through the city. In order to reach D.C., the troops would have to detach the cars from the train and pull each car by horse westward on Pratt Street to the next train station on Camden Street, about 10 blocks down. There was just one problem, though. Though Maryland was a Union state, the residents of Baltimore were either anti-war or very sympathetic to the Confederate cause. They had transferred all but the last 2 cars and were in the process of pulling those cars by horse. When they reached Gay Street, the crowd began blocking the tracks with wooden timbers, metal anchors, even dumping sand onto the tracks. The officers in the regiment managed to get the car back on the tracks and attempted to continue. The road in this area was going through repairs, and so piles of paving stones were lying around. These stones found their way through the windows of some of these train cars. As the cars sat there full of troops, the crowd began taunting them. Unable to complete the transfer, the 2 cars returned to the President Street train station. The remaining troops would now have to march to Camden Street. The troops unloaded their gear among jeering crowds and attempted to march in formation up President Street. This had no effect on the mob that then began surrounding the troops. By the time they turned on Pratt Street and reached the Jones Fall Bridge, the mob had completely blocked the path and were breaking windows and throwing paving stones at the troops. A soldier was hit by a stone so hard he fell in front of a port customs officer named Edward W. Betty, dropping his musket. Betty picked up the musket and fired at the troops. Frightened, officers ordered their troops to open fire. They began to shoot into the mob, and a huge fight soon broke out. Small plumes of brick fragments jumped out from nearby buildings after being struck by lead. Many balls cracked through skulls and brain matter scattered. They tore through fingers, abdomens, and bowels, leaving trails of chunky crimson on the street. A total of 4 soldiers and 11 civilians were killed in the incident. Baltimore's mayor soon learned of the riot and made a beeline to Camden Street. As he saw the crowd approach, he picked up a musket and kept the crowd back by force. Baltimore police soon arrived and helped the troops get to the train station, blocking the rioters at gunpoint until the regiment was able to leave on the train. Even as the train began to pull out, residents tried to block the tracks with obstacles, which the police were quick to remove. A few short hours after the initial riot, another train of troops, this time with about 500 soldiers from Pennsylvania, arrived at the President Street station. Baltimore police were still at the Camden Street station. The mob once again began attacking the cars. This time, the soldiers, many of them in civilian clothes, were ready for a brawl and came out fighting hand to hand. Already dealing with enough violence for one day, the troops were ordered back into the cars and the train was returned to Pennsylvania. Many Confederate sympathizers would attempt to compare the Pratt Street riot to the Boston Massacre. In response to the riot, Lincoln declared martial law in the state of Maryland on April 27th. Union troops were sent to Baltimore, specifically Fort McHenry and Federal Hill, in order to keep Maryland in the Union by force. On Federal Hill, earthworks were built and cannons were mounted, pointing toward the city. Responding to martial law, the Maryland legislature took up the idea of secession on the 29th, but voted to stay in the Union. They did agree that the hostilities in the state stemmed from the transfer of troops through the state. Maryland's governor asked President Lincoln not to send any more troops through Maryland in order to avoid any more bloodshed. But if you know where D.C. is located, it's easy to understand why Lincoln declined.